Our next speaker is Emma Matcham. She's a PhD candidate over from the University of Wisconsin, just wrapping up her PhD just in the next couple of months. And her current research looks at potassium fertility and soybean yields. So today's talk is on foliar application. So welcome.
Yeah, thank you so much for the invitation and the introduction. Again, my name is Emma, and today I'm going to be talking about foliar nutrient applications. I'm going to talk a little bit about using them in high-yielding soybean systems, and then identifying some nutrient deficiencies at the end. And forgive me, this is my first hybrid extension event, so I am both a little nervous and still figuring out the technology. I'm going to start with an overview of foliar fertilizer products and compare them to soybean annual nutrient need. And then I'm going to get into some results from some foliar product trials and share some considerations for evaluating new products. At the end, I'm going to talk about scouting for nutrient deficiencies and identifying any nutrient deficiencies that you might come across. One of the complicated things about foliar fertilizers is there's a really broad range of foliar fertilizer products in terms of formulation, cost, and recommended uses. Today, I'm going to focus on foliar fertilizer formulations that can be tank mixed with crop protectant products and are recommended for use in soybean. These usually cost less per acre than other fertilizers, but that low cost is related to the low per acre application rates. Foliar fertilizer labels almost always recommend less than 2 pounds of nutrient per acre. And the low application rates of nutrients in foliar fertilizer products typically account for very little of the nutrient needs of soybean over a given season. This graph shows uptake of nutrients in soybean plants, and the x-axis shows time over the course of the growing season, and the y-axis shows total uptake of nitrogen. The different colors here correspond to different plant parts. And on the right side of the graph, you can see that by the end of the growing season, soybean takes up around 300 pounds of nitrogen per acre when yields are about 82 bushels. Foliar fertilizers apply around 1 pound or 2 of nitrogen per acre, depending on the product, and that's not making much of a dent in the annual nutrient need of soybean, which is around 300 pounds per acre of nitrogen. This table shows the total uptake and removal of different nutrients per bushel of grain, and if you multiply the numbers in this table by your estimated yield, you can estimate your nutrient needs on a per acre basis. For nutrients that are used in lower quantities in the plant, like boron or iron, foliar fertilizers might supply a really large percentage of the annual needs of soybean on a per acre basis. But it's important to note that, especially for macronutrients, foliar fertilizers are not a substitute for other components in your fertility program because they're just not supplying enough nutrient to be a substitute product. Now that we've gotten on the same page about foliar fertilizers, what they are, what they're not, and how they compare to annual nutrient needs, I'm going to start by overviewing some past foliar fertilizer trial results, starting in the 1970s. I'm going to go over these trials really fast, but I promise at the end we will go over trends and the take-home points from them. So don't worry if I'm skipping over some of the details. Each of these slides has the number of site years in the upper left-hand corner, and then the number of, or the nutrients that the trial tested in the upper right-hand corner. The responsive site percentages in the lower left represent the proportion of site years where higher yields were achieved in the fertilized plots compared to the unfertilized plots. And the responsive nutrients in the lower right-hand corner describe which of the nutrients tested contributed to higher yield in the fertilized plots. In this study in Iowa in the 1970s, there were 6 site years and 4 nutrients tested. Foliar fertilizers increased yield at all sites by up to 8 bushels per acre compared to the unfertilized plots. And the highest yields were achieved when all 4 nutrients were applied in combination. At the same time, there was a really similar trial in Wisconsin that had 2 site years, and both site years were responsive, but they only saw a 1.4 bushel per acre yield increase associated with nitrogen application. The other nutrients tested did not impact yield. In Minnesota, a very detailed trial was conducted after the somewhat conflicting results of Iowa and Wisconsin trials. But here, only 1 out of 16 site years had an increase in yield associated with foliar nutrient application, and they tested over a dozen different nutrient source combinations. Back in Iowa in the 1990s, a larger 26 site year trial that included both small plots and large on-farm strips tested 5 different liquid foliar products, and those included nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, iron, zinc, and boron applications. 3 out of the 26 site years had higher yields associated with fertilizer application. Where those higher yields were observed, it was roughly a 2 bushel per acre difference, and they only saw benefit from the macro and secondary nutrients, not from the micros, iron, zinc, and boron. Michigan has done a lot of foliar fertilizer work over the last couple of years. There were over 117 trials in Michigan focusing on different nutrient combinations in the last dozen years alone. I'm not going to have time to go through all of them today, but I do want to point out that this third column of the table shows that overall the percentage of site years that saw significant yield increases was generally really low. The major exception to this trend was the manganese work they did, where 2 different trials each had 2 different site years. In one trial, the foliar fertilizer was applied prophylactically, like in the other trials we've been reviewing. And when used prophylactically, manganese foliar fertilizer does not increase yield. But when they wait to spray this fertilizer until after they saw visual symptoms of manganese deficiency, like this yellowing in the picture, the fertilizer was associated with a roughly 2 bushel per acre increase in yield. This is the last trial I'd like to talk about today. It also occurred in Michigan. And it addresses a really frequent question we have about foliar fertilizer trials. Folks are concerned that we're only putting out trials in fields that are so productive and so fertile that we're never going to see a response to a fertilizer input. And this study was designed in response to that concern. It was set up so that researchers could soil sample each field right before the field season and design custom blends of nutrients that might be limiting in that particular site. And using this approach, only 3 out of the 20 site years had an increase in yield associated with fertilizer application. And at only 1 of those sites was the yield increase sufficient to pay for the cost of product. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and review those last trials. Overall, 12% of the site years that I shared with you had a significant increase in yield associated with fertilizer application. Of those responsive sites, most were looking at a roughly 2 bushel per acre yield increase. And 12% is roughly 1 in 8 fields. That's a pretty high prevalence. But many of those trials were performed on soybean varieties that are very different from what we grow today. And the climate today is not exactly the same as it was in the 70s and 80s. So I went ahead and recalculated that overall responsive trial rate just for data collected in the last 30 years in the upper Midwest. A lot of the farmers I've talked to are concerned that foliar fertilizer products are actually becoming more important for yield in the last few years, but I am not seeing that trend. I wouldn't say that this 8% of trials being responsive in the last 30 years says that these products are becoming less influential on yield, but I would say that I don't see evidence that these products are becoming more important for yield on soybean in the last few years. So that takes us from the 70s through the 2010s in the upper Midwest specifically. And the effect of foliar fertilizers in published research was really small and inconsistent. So I'm going to talk more about a trial that took place in 2019 and 2020 that was designed specifically to help pick up on small, inconsistent yield increases. We worked with a really large team to gather data across 16 states because in general, when you have a larger data set, it's easier to identify responses that only happen occasionally or in certain environments. And this took place in 2019 and 2020. We have 46 site years of data. 4 of them are in Minnesota, and another 11 are from neighboring states. So with the distribution of site years that you can see in the map, we have good coverage over the eastern US, which is where most soybeans are grown. And we also strongly represent the region that folks in Minnesota are farming. We tested 6 commercially available foliar nutrient products along with an untreated control treatment. And the foliar fertilizers were applied at the growth stage R3, or the beginning of pod development, to align with common fungicide and insecticide applications. This is also a period of really rapid nutrient uptake in plants and a common recommendation for foliar fertilizer application. Products were applied at a rate within the range of recommended rates on the label, and products in this trial contained 2 or more nutrients. This slide is in metric, but 1 kilogram per hectare is about the same as 1 pound per acre. And application rates did vary between products, but were generally really low, about a kilogram per hectare in most cases, with slightly higher application rates of nitrogen and potassium in max and pack K. In addition to collecting yield at the end of the season, we collected some in-season measurements, including soil, tissue, and grain samples. I'm going to go ahead and get into the yield data right away, since I think that's generally the most interesting. This is the yield data averaged by treatment across all 46 site years, and I displayed it as a box plot. So on the y-axis, the height of the box represents the average yield, and the line within each box is the mean yield, and each box across the x-axis is a different treatment. These boxes look really similar to each other, but in order to test whether the yields were actually different, we used a statistical test called ANOVA to determine how much of the small differences between boxes is due to treatment, site year, the replication number, or error. And using that analysis of variance, we determined that any differences in yield could not be attributed to treatments. There were not significant differences in yield among foliar fertilizer treatments in this study. In addition to performing that analysis of variance, we did visualize the relationship between yield of the untreated control plots and the fertilized treatments. In these 1-1 plots, the yield of treated plots is displayed on the y-axis, and the yield of the untreated plots is on the x-axis. Each observation in this plot, so each little circle or triangle marker, represents the yield averaged within the 6 plots of a single site year. And the yield of the fertilized plots is how high that marker falls, and the yield of the unfertilized plot is how far left or right that marker falls. The different dotted lines represent a 10% difference in yield between the untreated and control plots at the same site. The observed yield differences were small and inconsistent, which does compare to the past foliar fertilizer trials that I shared earlier. Where we did see higher yields in fertilized plots, the differences were not isolated to high pH sites that might have low micronutrient availability, and they weren't isolated to low fertility sites where we'd expect to see a response to macronutrient application. And all site years with yields above 75 bushels per acre had average yield in the fertilizer plots within 10% of the average yield of the unfertilized plots for all 6 fertilizers tested. Many folks expected to see a larger benefit of these products in high yielding soybean, but that's just not the case. We also performed a partial profit analysis to determine whether the yield differences or lack thereof could be associated with differences in profitability. This analysis included the cost of the foliar fertilizer product, but it didn't include the cost of application, since these products are usually tank mixed with a fungicide or an insecticide. And 1 out of the 6 treatments had significantly lower partial profits than the untreated control, at a grain price of $15 per bushel, and half the treatments had a significantly lower partial profits at a grain price of $10 per bushel as compared to the untreated control. This partial profit analysis that I just shared was really conservative, and it doesn't account for the increased economic risk that you face if you're applying foliar fertilizers without tank mixing. First off, if you're making a separate pass across your field with the sprayer, you are going to increase the cost of application due to fuel, labor, wear and tear on your equipment. And secondly, every time you drive over your field after R1, you can lose 1 to 5% of your yield for every pass after flowering. And that's due to damage from the wheel tracks. So if you have a smaller sprayer and you have more tracks within each field, you're going to be closer to that 5% yield loss per pass. If you're using a bigger sprayer, you're going to see lower yield loss for every individual pass. So we did learn quite a bit from performing this larger study across the Eastern US. The response to foliar fertilizers was very uniform across different fertility levels and soil types in our study. And it was also consistent across yield levels within our study. High yielding soybeans did not respond to foliar fertilizers. Foliar fertilizer application also did not change the grain composition, the protein and oil in the grain. And it also didn't change the macronutrient concentration within leaf samples. But leaf tissue micronutrient concentration did vary between treatments. If you're interested in learning more about this 2019 and 2020 trial specifically, there is an annual report available at coolbean.info. That is Sean Conley's Wisconsin soybean extension website. And there's an upcoming USB extension article that will be available both at coolbean.info and at all of the cooperating extension websites. So be on the lookout for that. It should be posted in the next couple weeks. I've gotten through most of the data I want to share with you today. So now I'm going to move on to considerations for future foliar fertilizer products before getting into some scouting considerations. Right now, there's this cycle that happens whenever a new prophylactic foliar fertilizer nutrient product is released to the market. And it's very consistent. It happens every time. Extension folks are going to start getting calls about it where folks ask us to perform a trial, compare it to other foliar fertilizer products. We perform that trial, we don't get significant results. And I laugh about this cycle, it happens every time. But I do take a lot of pride in working in the part of the cycle where we're providing unbiased information about these products. But the thing about waiting for extension trials on foliar fertilizer products is that they take time. And we can't test every product. So there are some things you can do to evaluate future products that might not have independent testing and separate out some of the true information from some of the more marketing claims. When you see new products, there are 3 questions you can ask to help evaluate them. Are you seeing trial results that took place over multiple years and multiple sites? This is really important because if you run enough locations, you can probably get a favorable result at least one. But you want to see that this product had a really consistent yield benefit in some other environments to know if it might also be beneficial on your farm. And then you could ask, can you get information about this from someone who isn't selling it? Places to look might be a nearby on-farm research network, or maybe a neighbor that set out some test strips on their own farm last year. And then, can you try this product on a few test strips on your own farm? Instead of applying it to all of your acres the first year it's available, I'd really recommend trying it on just a few paired tests. And I'm sharing these tips not because I don't think foliar fertilizers never work, but because the trial results from the past make me pretty skeptical that foliar fertilizers are a good choice overall in most growing situations. When your beans are not displaying visual symptoms of a nutrient deficiency, you're probably going to lose money by applying foliar fertilizers. So let's talk about what those symptoms of nutrient deficiency might look like so that you can identify them on your own farm. Let's start with manganese and iron. In this region, iron deficiency chlorosis is more common, and it happens on neutral to high pH soils. The yellowing is going to occur mostly on the new growth, so near the top of the plant. But manganese deficiency is going to happen on more acidic soils, and the yellowing will go throughout the plant. For both of these, we talk about interveinal chlorosis. So the veins of the leaves will be more green than the surrounding leaf tissue, which will be more yellow. If you've had iron deficiency chlorosis on your farm and want some help managing it, I would recommend you check out the University of Minnesota Extension website because they have a lot more information than I do on appropriate iron rates, timings, sources, and IDC prevention. Another nutrient deficiency that can look similar to manganese or iron deficiency is zinc. This is more common in the Midwest than the Mid-South, but I wanted to talk about it since the symptoms can be confusing. It does have that same interveinal yellowing, but instead of having a smooth gradient from yellow to green, it's going to be mottled. Think of it as zinc looks like a tie-dye effect of yellow and green, but your iron or your manganese will look more like a spray paint can running out of paint. So one is a gradient, and zinc is going to be the mottled spotty yellowing between the veins. Sulfur is another nutrient to watch out for. Sulfur deficient soybeans will have yellow small leaves near the top of the plant, and they will not have prominently green veins the way some of the other nutrients we talked about do. Sulfur deficiencies have been slowly increasing over the past few years since acid rain prevalence has gone down in the US. And given increasing concerns about sulfur deficiency, we do have another large multi-state soybean fertility study to specifically look at soil applied sulfur products. At a glance, we had 43 sites in 9 states looking at 3 different sulfur and nitrogen sources. And we had a really wide range of environments so that we could help identify where sulfur deficiency is most likely to be a large concern. Now, I mentioned earlier that this sulfur study was looking at soil applied products specifically. It is not a foliar fertilizer trial. And we're focusing on those soil applied products because sulfur is used at a fairly high rate within soybeans. Soybeans take up 1/5 of a pound of sulfur per bushel. So a 50 bushel per acre field will use about 10 pounds of sulfur per acre. And a lot of that is currently available from the soil or from annual deposition. But since the soybean needs a higher rate of sulfur than it does other nutrients, we're focusing on products and application methods that can supply more than 1 pound or 2 of sulfur per acre. Foliar fertilizer products are a lot more appropriate for addressing micronutrient deficiencies like iron, zinc, or manganese than macro or secondary nutrient deficiencies. So when you're keeping an eye out for nutrient deficiencies, there are a few places to focus your efforts. The first is your high or low pH areas. When pH is around 6.6 or 6.7, most necessary plant nutrients are biologically available. But if your pH gets below 5.5 or above 6.8, those nutrients can be really hard for the plant to access. And secondly, water plays a key role in nutrient cycling and moving nutrients into the soil solution from other pools of nutrients in the soil. Areas with prolonged waterlogging can be prone to displaying some nutrient deficiencies, and areas with insufficient water can have issues moving nutrients actually into the roots themselves, because most nutrients are moving with water into the plant. If you think you have nutrient deficiency symptoms, which could be stunted growth, interveinal chlorosis, or necrotic tissue without another cause for those problems that you know about, it's a great idea to pull some paired samples. In this example, we're going to talk about the yellow area of the field diagram being an area of concern, and the rest of the field looking relatively healthy. In this case, I'd recommend you pull 2 sets of samples, one from the yellow area and the other from elsewhere in the field. And at each location, you should pull a soil and a tissue sample. Before sampling, you should check with your lab to understand their recommended sampling methods, because each lab has their equipment calibrated for different quantities of leaf tissues and different dry or wet samples. And then once you have your results back from the area of concern and the remainder healthy portion of the field, you can compare those sets of test results and determine whether there are differences in the nutrients in those areas. And you can also compare the results back to the state nutrient management guidelines. So this can help you identify which nutrient might have been a problem. I'm going to wrap up with a few take-home messages that hold across soybean of all yield levels. Prophylactic foliar fertilizers do not increase soybean yields, so you should probably wait to apply foliar fertilizers until after you see visual symptoms of nutrient deficiency. And if you do, we recommend pulling paired tissue and soil samples to help identify an underlying cause. With that, I'd like to thank everybody that made this work possible. We had a really great team to help collect data across a large range of the US. And many state checkoff boards funded individual state sites, and we also received funding from the United Soybean Board. If you're interested in learning more about foliar fertilizers, the sulfur research that I mentioned briefly, or biological products, I recommend keeping an eye out for Science for Success projects. This is a new initiative from USB that specifically funds multi-state research, and it's a great source of new information. Thank you so much for being here today, both you in the room here and folks online. I'm going to open it up to questions. And yeah. The question was about whether we've done specific trials targeting fields above 70 bushels per acre. Is that correct? Almost a quarter of our fields in the trial I discussed from 2019 and 2020 were specifically those high yielding soybeans above, I want to say 72 bushels an acre. And that was a quarter of our data set. We analyzed that data set separately from the rest, in addition to pooling it with everything else. And we saw exactly the same trend. And we were seeing no differences in yield associated with treatment. And any differences in yield we did see were related to site. And then each site responded the same as well. So we didn't see a treatment by site interaction. And that was true for that high yielding subset. Our lowest yielding subset, which was mostly centered on the Carolinas, where their soybeans yield less overall, and in the data set overall. Our low yielding subset focused on below 35 bushels per acre, I believe. And then here on my last slide, I can give you a card at the end if you'd like it. We have a publication in Agronomy Journal, and it's available for free to the public. It's open access. And in the results, we share the information about high, low, and medium yielding fields specifically. But we're not seeing a difference above 70 bushels or below. Any other questions here in the room? Any questions online? All right, I'm gonna pass it back. Thank you very much for running the technology for me, and thank you for being here today. It's been great to meet folks.
Emma informed me that she's wrapping up her PhD very shortly and will be moving to Florida and anxious to get away from Midwestern winter. So I wish you the best of luck.